July 21st, 1992. An album arrives at record stores across America with an orange stuffed toy on its cover, a thrift store reject photographed by artist Mike Kelly. Inside that package is something the music industry desperately wants: Sonic Youth's attempt at a hit record. The timing couldn't be better. 9 months earlier, their label mates and touring partners Nirvana released Nevermind and accidentally conquered the world. Now Sonic Youth, the band that influenced Nirvana, that brought grunge to the mainstream's doorstep, that spent a decade as underground royalty, has hired that same producer. The expectation is simple: do what Nirvana did. The album is called Dirty. It will peak at number 6 in the UK and number 83 in America. The label will call it a disappointment. Critics will call it a masterpiece. Fans will argue about it for 3 decades. But here's what nobody expected. Sonic Youth never wanted to be the next Nirvana. They wanted to hijack the mainstream with avant-garde noise, political fury, and songs about murder, sexual harassment, and the rot at America's core. They wanted to sneak art terrorism onto MTV while everyone was looking for the next Teen Spirit. They almost succeeded, and their failure might be the most punk rock thing they ever did. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is how Sonic Youth made the album that should have changed everything, and then walked away when it didn't. To understand Dirty, you need to understand where Sonic Youth stood in 1991, and it wasn't where you'd expect. They were 11 years into their career. Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon, married creative partners, the band's twin engines, along with guitarist Lee Ranaldo and drummer Steve Shelley, had spent the 1980s rewriting the rules of rock guitar. Alternative tunings, drumsticks jammed between strings, feedback sculpted into melody, albums with names like Bad Moon Rising and Evil that sounded like transmissions from a parallel dimension where punk never died and art school never ended. Their 1988 double album Daydream Nation was their masterpiece. 70 minutes of beautiful chaos that made them the coolest band on the planet without selling many records. It peaked at number 99 in the UK. In America, it didn't chart at all. But something was shifting. Alternative music was creeping toward the mainstream. REM had gone gold. The Pixies were on MTV, and major labels were hunting for the next wave. By 1990, Sonic Youth did something controversial. They signed with Geffen Records for $300,000. Hardcore fans screamed sellout. The band didn't care. They'd spent too many years on independent labels with distribution problems. Their first Geffen album, Goo, was everything a major label debut should be. Accessible but uncompromising, featuring a collaboration with Public Enemy's Chuck D. It reached number 96 on the Billboard 200. Then came the tour that changed everything. Summer 1991. Sonic Youth headed to Europe for a festival run. Opening for them, a little-known Seattle band called Nirvana. Filmmaker Dave Markey came along to document the tour. The resulting documentary would be called 1991, The Year Punk Broke, a title that started as a joke after they saw Motley Crue covering the Sex Pistols on TV. That August, while touring European festivals, Sonic Youth debuted 2 new songs: Orange Rolls, Angels Spit, and Chapel Hill. They were demoing material for their next album, recording rough versions on an 8-track in their Hoboken rehearsal space. The songs were long, instrumental, chaotic, classic Sonic Youth. Then, 1 month after the tour ended, everything changed. Nirvana's Nevermind was released in September 1991. By January 1992, it had knocked Michael Jackson off the top of the charts. Grunge exploded. Alternative rock became mainstream rock overnight. Suddenly, Sonic Youth's next album carried expectations they'd never faced before. If their label mates could sell 10 million copies, surely the band that influenced them could sell 1 million, right? Wrong. But that misunderstanding would define everything about Dirty. November 1991. Sonic Youth was demoing songs in their Hoboken rehearsal space when news arrived that shattered their world. Their friend Joe Cole, roadie for Black Flag, and Henry Rollins, a fixture in their circle, had been shot and killed during a robbery outside his Venice Beach home. The murder was senseless, brutal, unsolved. When Kim Gordon got the call from Rollins, she burst into tears. She wouldn't get over it for years. Thurston Moore wrote a song called 100%. Gordon wrote one called JC. Both would end up on the album they were preparing to record, an album that was supposed to be about catching Nirvana's wave, but was rapidly becoming something much darker. The label wanted Butch Vig. Of course they did. Vig had just produced the biggest rock album in years. If he could make Nirvana sound like that, imagine what he could do with Sonic Youth. Vig was interested, but uncertain. When he visited Moore and Gordon's apartment for their first meeting, Moore told him something unexpected. He wanted the album to sound like a single Vig had produced years earlier for a forgotten hardcore band called Mecht Mensch. Not like Nevermind, like raw, aggressive, stripped-down punk. Vig's vision was different. He wanted to tighten their song arrangements, focus on crafting guitar sounds, maybe make something actually radio-friendly. When Sonic Youth sent him cassettes of their demos in late 1991, Vig was pleased but confused. The tapes consisted of long instrumentals with unclear song structures. The second batch showed progress. The band had done some self-editing. Songs were taking shape. But this was still Sonic Youth. Nothing about this would be easy. In early 1992, Vig moved to New York City for 3 months. They set up at the Magic Shop on Crosby Street in Soho. The plan: record 18 songs, trim it down to 15, make Sonic Youth's first truly accessible album. But accessibility is relative. While they were recording, current events kept bleeding into the sessions. The 1992 election was heating up. The Anita Hill hearings had exposed sexual harassment in the highest levels of government. A scandal at Geffen involved an executive accused of harassing his secretary. Moore wrote a song called Youth Against Fascism, with the line, "I believe Anita Hill, the judge will rot in hell." Gordon wrote Swimsuit Issue about the Geffen scandal, including the lyric, "Don't touch my breast, I'm just working at my desk." This was Sonic Youth's idea of making a commercial album. Political fury set to the biggest, loudest guitars they'd ever recorded. March 1992. The Magic Shop sessions began with a technical innovation that would define the album's sound. Sonic Youth had heard a soundboard tape from a recent show, where Lee Ranaldo's guitar was panned hard left and Thurston Moore's was panned hard right, with Kim Gordon's bass down the center. The separation was stunning. You could hear every scraping, feedbacking detail. They decided to record Dirty the same way. Vig's approach was methodical. Unlike Goo, which had featured infinite overdubs and a somewhat messy mix, Dirty would be cleaner, more focused. Overdubs were restricted to flavor. The songs would be shorter, punchier. Most clocked in at 3 to 4 minutes. Radio-friendly by Sonic Youth standards. But short didn't mean simple. 100%, the opening track, begins with screeching feedback before launching into a drum-heavy thrash that sounds like rage given form. Gordon's Swimsuit Issue features her naming every model in the March 1992 Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue over grinding guitars. Drunken Butterfly uses lyrics taken entirely from Heart songs. One day, Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat and Fugazi stopped by. He'd ordered food from a restaurant around the corner and called Thurston to kill time. They convinced him to come to the studio and add some feedback guitar to Youth Against Fascism while he waited for his meal. MacKaye's spontaneous noise appears throughout the track, fading in and out at random, a punk legend's drive-by contribution. The album's final song, Crème Brûlée, was recorded almost by accident. Ronaldo was playing guitar while Gordon sang, Shelley played drums, and Moore was still trying to turn on his amplifier. They captured it anyway, the sound of Sonic Youth assembling itself in real time. After completing 18 songs, they faced a problem. Too much material. They trimmed it to 15 for CD and cassette. For the vinyl double LP, they added an extra track called Stalker. B-sides included Ronaldo's Genetic and Gordon's explosive Hendrix Necro. Songs good enough to be singles for most bands, relegated to bonus tracks for Sonic Youth. Andy Wallace, who'd mixed Nevermind, handled most of the mixing at Sound on Sound Studio. Vig mixed Creme Brulee. Sonic Youth mixed Nick Fit, a cover of an obscure Untouchable song featuring Ian MacKay's brother Alex. The result sounded huge, loud, aggressive, accessible by Sonic Youth standards, but still undeniably them. Angular, political, weird. The artwork came from Mike Kelly's Youth series. Thrift store stuffed animals photographed with disturbing innocence. They titled it Dirty. The working title had been My Life to Live, but dirty felt right. Gritty, provocative, a one-word summary of everything America was in 1992. Now they just had to see if anyone would buy it. Before Dirty was even released, Sonic Youth faced an impossible equation. DGC Records had just watched Nirvana sell 10 million copies of Nevermind. They'd produced t-shirts reading Sonic Summer 92, expecting similar success. The marketing machine was gearing up for a crossover hit that would bring underground rock fully into the mainstream. But Sonic Youth wasn't Nirvana, and they knew it. The music was too difficult to be hugely popular, Lee Ranaldo would later explain. I don't think any of us as singers are palatable to the mass market. The music had twisted changes, noise, and dissonance. Nirvana was straightforward. They were on message with what they presented. The sound and the emotions were the total package. Our stuff was all over the map compared to that. Thurston Moore was even more blunt. We thought it would sell itself in a way, but it wasn't like that. We were a little too old at that time anyway. The age issue was real. Moore was 33. Gordon was 39. They'd been making uncompromising art rock for over a decade. The idea that they'd suddenly become MTV darlings competing with Pearl Jam and Soundgarden was absurd. But the label wanted to believe. There were creative tensions too. Vig had pushed for more traditional song structures. The band wanted to retain their experimental edge. The compromise satisfied neither vision completely. Dirty was too weird for mainstream radio but too accessible for hardcore fans who preferred their earlier work. Behind the album's aggressive exterior lay deep personal pain. The death of Joe Cole haunted the sessions. When Gordon sang JC, she could barely get through it without tearing up. When Moore screamed through 100%, asking if you can forgive the boy who shot you in the head, or should you get revenge, it wasn't abstract. It was raw grief channeled into noise. The political songs carried their own weight. Youth Against Fascism named names, calling out President Bush, referencing Anita Hill, shouting "I believe Anita Hill" at a moment when half the country was calling her a liar. Swimsuit Issue was even more specific, targeting sexual harassment at their own label. These weren't safe topics for a band trying to sell records. But Sonic Youth had never played it safe. That was the whole problem, and the whole point. As they prepared for the album's release, a different kind of struggle emerged, living up to a documentary that had accidentally captured lightning in a bottle. 1991, the year punk broke, was released in limited theaters in spring 1992, showing Sonic Youth and Nirvana before the latter became the biggest band in the world. It was a time capsule of punk's last innocent moment, and it made Dirty feel like it was arriving too late to a party that had already ended. July 1992. Sonic Youth premiered most of Dirty on a short Northeast tour, culminating in a free Central Park show on July 4th. Then, on July 21st, the album officially dropped. The numbers looked promising at first. Dirty hit number 6 on the UK albums chart, Sonic Youth's highest ever UK showing. In America, it reached number 83, their best US performance to date. For a band that had never charted before Goo, these were career highs. DGC pushed hard. They released 100% as the lead single in the same month. The music video, directed by then unknown Spike Jonze and featuring skateboarder-turned-actor Jason Lee, got heavy rotation on MTV's 120 Minutes. The song climbed to number 4 on the Billboard Alternative Songs chart and number 28 in the UK. In September, Sonic Youth made their U.S. network television debut on Late Night with David Letterman. They played 100%. At the song's climax, they smashed their equipment, a moment of genuine chaos on late-night TV that felt both thrilling and slightly uncomfortable. Underground rock's coolest band was crossing over, but on their own terms. Critics loved it. Entertainment Weekly called it the band's finest hour, much-needed proof that rock guitar bands could still make vital music. Rolling Stone ranked it alongside Daydream Nation and Sister as one of their most unified works. By year's end, Entertainment Weekly would name Dirty the best album of 1992. But the commercial response told a different story. 100% wasn't the crossover hit DGC anticipated. Geffen executive Mark Cates admitted the song simply wasn't radio-friendly enough. The weird tunings, Gordon's and Moore's unconventional vocals, the political fury. It was all too much for mainstream rock radio still playing Guns N' Roses and Metallica. The second single, Youth Against Fascism, performed even worse. Despite a video directed by Nick Egan showing the band playing in the LA River's concrete flood channel with FMX bikers, radio programmers wouldn't touch a song where someone yells, "The President's a war pig," and "I believe Anita Hill." Sugarcane, released in early 1993, did better, reaching number 26 in the UK. But it was too little, too late. The album stalled. The mainstream crossover DGC had envisioned never materialized. In November, Sonic Youth appeared on the UK's Later, with Jools Holland performing raw, chaotic versions of Sugarcane and Drunken Butterfly. They seemed completely unbothered by the commercial disappointment. If anything, they seemed relieved. The critics' praise and commercial failure created a strange dichotomy. For new fans discovering alternative rock through Nirvana, Dirty was a gateway drug to weirder sounds. For longtime fans, it felt like a compromise. For the band, it was exactly what they wanted to make. "We were having fun with what's serious," Moore told the New York Times. He wasn't apologizing, he was explaining. Dirty didn't sell like Nevermind, it didn't need to. Its impact came in ways the music industry doesn't measure. For an entire generation discovering alternative rock in the early 1990s, Dirty was a next-level education. If Nirvana was the gateway, Sonic Youth was the rabbit hole. Proof that alternative rock could be political, avant-garde, genuinely dangerous. The album legitimized tastes that went beyond flannel and power chords. Kim Gordon's role was particularly transformative. In an era when the Riot Grrrl movement was gathering momentum, Gordon's fierce bass playing and confrontational lyrics on songs like Swimsuit Issue and Orange Roll's Angel's Spit influenced countless young women to pick up instruments and rail against a male-dominated scene. She wasn't playing the part of a female rock star. She was rewriting what that could mean. The album's political courage mattered. In 1992, with George Bush running for re-election and conservative culture warriors declaring war on alternative values, Sonic Youth refused to play it safe. Youth Against Fascism, specifically called out power, named names, took sides. 20 years before social media activism, they were using major label distribution to spread genuinely radical messages. Musically, Dirty proved something crucial. You could work with a major label and maintain artistic integrity. The album sounded massive. Vig and Wallace's production gave it a professional sheen the band's earlier work lacked, but it was unmistakably Sonic Youth. The strange tunings, the feedback, the experimental structures remained intact, just louder. For other underground bands, this mattered enormously. Sonic Youth had opened the door, and bands like Pavement, Yo La Tengo, and countless others walked through it. The message was clear. You didn't have to compromise your vision to access better resources and wider distribution. The album's chart performance, number 6 in the UK, number 83 in the US, actually helped its legacy. It didn't sell enough to brand the band as sellouts, but it charted high enough to prove underground rock could compete. This was the sweet spot. Credible enough for indie fans, successful enough to inspire others. Dirty also marked a creative peak. After this, Sonic Youth would intentionally pivot away from accessibility. Their 1994 follow-up, Experimental Jet Set, Trash and No Star, was deliberately lo-fi despite working with the same producer. They'd proven they could make a relatively accessible album. Now they could move on. Decades later, Dirty remains a touchstone. It's the album fans recommend to newcomers. It's the one that proved noise rock could sound this good. It's the bridge between the underground 1980s and the alternative mainstream of the 1990s. And the document of the moment when underground rock's coolest band briefly, reluctantly, became almost famous. The controversies around Dirty were never about the music itself, they were about everything surrounding it. The sellout accusations started before the album dropped. Hardcore fans who'd followed Sonic Youth since their SST Records days saw working with Nirvana's producer as calculated careerism. Online forums and zine reviews accused them of chasing mainstream success, of betraying their underground roots for MTV exposure. The band's response was essentially, so what? They'd spent a decade making albums that nobody heard because of distribution problems. Why shouldn't they access better resources? The criticism stung anyway. Punk rock's purity tests always do. More serious was the weight of Joe Cole's unsolved murder. Both 100% and JC referenced the December 1991 killing, which remained and remains unsolved. Cole was shot in the face during a robbery outside the Venice Beach home he shared with Henry Rollins. The killers were never caught despite the case appearing on Unsolved Mysteries. For Sonic Youth, particularly Gordon and Moore, the murder was devastating. They weren't exploiting tragedy for artistic material. They were processing genuine grief through the only outlet they had. When critics questioned whether it was appropriate to write songs about a friend's murder, the band offered no apologies. Art comes from pain. That's how it's always worked. Swimsuit Issue created different problems. Gordon's specific references to sexual harassment at Geffen, writing about an unnamed executive sent to therapy for harassing his secretary, made some at the label uncomfortable. The song's ending, where Gordon reads off names of Sports Illustrated swimsuit models, was criticized as objectification by some feminists and as angry performance art by others. Gordon stood her ground. The song wasn't celebrating those models. It was critiquing how their images were used to normalize a culture where women like the harassed secretary weren't believed or protected. The most interesting controversy was the one that didn't happen. The album didn't spark the backlash other major label alternative bands faced. Part of this was strategic. Sonic Youth never oversold their commercial aspirations. They did the TV appearances, made the videos, toured extensively, but they never pretended to be the next Nirvana. Their low-key approach to success actually protected them. The Marc Jacobs Grunge collection video for Sugarcane became its own minor controversy. Jacobs, a close friend of Gordon's, designed a Perry Ellis collection inspired by grunge fashion and asked Sonic Youth to appear in the runway show for the video. The performance featured model Chloe Sevigny's first film appearance. Fashion critics saw it as grunge being commodified. Sonic Youth saw it as art commenting on commodification, a subtle but crucial difference. Looking back, the biggest controversy might be the one nobody discussed at the time. The album's commercial failure was completely predictable. Everyone, the label, critics, even some fans, expected Dirty to be Sonic Youth's breakthrough. But a band making hour-long albums about murder, sexual harassment, and political corruption was never going to sell millions of copies, no matter how good the production was. The real controversy is that anyone thought it would. 32 years after its release, Dirty occupies a strange space in rock history, simultaneously overrated and underrated, forgotten and influential, a commercial failure that succeeded completely. It remains Sonic Youth's best-selling album. It never went gold, never approached platinum, but it outsold everything else they made. For new listeners discovering the band, it's usually the entry point, accessible enough to hook you, weird enough to keep you interested. The 2003 deluxe reissue introduced the album to a new generation. The bonus disc featured 8-track demos from their Hoboken rehearsal space showing how the songs evolved, instrumental versions of Drunken Butterfly, originally called Barracuda, Early takes on Wish Fulfillment, unreleased jams like Dreamfinger and Light Damage. The reissue reminded everyone that even Sonic Youth's rough demos sounded better than most bands' finished albums. Dirty influenced countless bands who came after. The Jesus and Mary Chain, My Bloody Valentine and Mogwai all cited Sonic Youth's guitar techniques. But Dirty specifically showed post-grunge bands that you could combine underground credibility with major label production values. Groups like Modest Mouse, The National, and even later Radiohead experiments drew from this blueprint. Kim Gordon's performance became even more relevant over time. As feminist discourse in rock evolved, Swimsuit Issue and Youth Against Fascism were re-examined as early examples of intersectional punk, combining anti-harassment activism, body autonomy, and political rage into 3-minute songs that slapped. Gordon became an icon for riot girl bands and later indie rock women who refused to be pigeonholed. The album's political content aged remarkably well. Youth Against Fascism feels more relevant in 2024 than it did in 1992. The line, "I believe Anita Hill" resonated differently after the Nalos Me Too movement. Songs that seemed aggressively topical in 1992 became timeless documents of resistance. Critically, Dirty has held up. It regularly appears on greatest albums lists. Rolling Stone, NME, Pitchfork all rank it among the essential alternative records of the 1990s. What was once criticized as too commercial is now praised for balancing accessibility with experimentation. The album's cover art, Mike Kelly's orange stuffed toy from his Youth series, became iconic. In 2018, streetwear brand Supreme featured it in a collection. The Metropolitan Museum of Art displays Kelly's original work with specific mention of its Sonic Youth connection. A photograph of a thrift store reject became high art. For Gen Z discovering 1990s alternative rock through TikTok and streaming, Dirty sounds simultaneously retro and contemporary. The production hasn't dated, the anger hasn't dulled, the experimentation still sounds fresh. New listeners don't hear it as a commercial compromise, they hear it as a noise rock masterpiece. Perhaps the ultimate legacy is this. Dirty proved you could make exactly the album you wanted and let the commercial chips fall where they may. Sonic Youth didn't chase hits. They made art, got it distributed widely, and moved on when it didn't sell millions. That attitude, make what matters, ignore the metrics, influenced 2 generations of independent artists. The album that failed to break Sonic Youth into the mainstream succeeded in something more important. It showed underground bands they could access major label resources without losing themselves. That lesson echoes through every independent artist who signs to a bigger label today. The story of Dirty is the story of American alternative rock's brief, strange moment of possibility. For about 18 months, from Nevermind in September 1991 to Kurt Cobain's death in April 1994, it seemed like underground music might actually conquer the mainstream. Major labels were signing punk bands. MTV was playing experimental videos. The freaks, for once, weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Sonic Youth was perfectly positioned to capitalize. They'd influenced the bands blowing up. They had major label support. They'd hired the right producer. Dirty should have been their victory lap. Instead, it became something more interesting. A document of creative integrity in the face of commercial pressure. The album succeeds precisely because it refuses to compromise. Every weird guitar tuning, every political reference, every moment of feedback and noise, it's all there, louder and clearer than ever, daring you to keep listening. The commercial failure doesn't diminish the album. If anything, it validates it. Sonic Youth made the album they wanted exactly as they imagined it, with resources they'd never had before. That it peaked at number 83 instead of number 1 doesn't matter. They got to make their art, got it heard widely, and then continued making art on their own terms for another 2 decades. After Dirty, Sonic Youth released 9 more albums. Some were more experimental, some more accessible, all were uncompromising. They headlined Lollapalooza. They influenced everyone from Radiohead to Sleater-Kinney. They remained cool for 30 years, an almost impossible feat. The band split in 2011 following Moore and Gordon's divorce. Their final shows were in Brazil. There was no reunion tour, no cash grab comeback. Sonic Youth began as an art project and ended as one. Perfect. Dirty sits in their catalog like a beautiful anomaly. The moment when underground rock's most uncompromising band got everything the music industry could offer and used it to make exactly the album they would have made anyway, just louder. That's the real lesson. The mainstream didn't change Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth tried to change the mainstream. It didn't work. But for one summer in 1992, the attempt itself was glorious. A noise rock Trojan horse wheeled into MTV's gates, filled with political fury and avant-garde chaos. 26 years after Joe Cole's murder, the crime remains unsolved. Dirty remains in print. The album Sonic Youth, made about grief, anger, politics, and noise, still sounds like nothing else, still influences new bands, still proves that commercial failure and artistic success aren't opposites. They're often the same thing. Sonic Youth never became the next Nirvana. Thank God for that. The world already had Nirvana. What it needed was Sonic Youth. Difficult, uncompromising, politically engaged, sonically adventurous. Dirty gave us that, amplified by major label resources and recorded for the ages. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories are perfect precisely because they don't have happy endings.